briefly. And then, so I'm at the same department with Dr. Michael Nimo. I'm an associate professor in the department. I'm also in charge of directing the Center for Cultural African Studies, we call it CICAS here at NUSC. So my background is in interdisciplinary studies. My PhD was in African studies, so I specialize in African history and African politics. So in my department, I'm the only one who teach in the two units. I teach in political science and I also teach in history. So I was drafted in as a guest lecturer. So I was asked to I speak on the independent movement. Yes. So I have prepared slides to guide us in this discussion, and I also circulated the readings that Michael alerted you guys to look at. This is going to be my third Zoom meeting for today. So please feel free to come in, and if there's anything that I say and you want to ask a question on, don't wait until the end. It's very difficult teaching on Zoom. Yes, face-to-face is more interactive. I like it that way, where you see each other, but on Zoom, you can easily fall asleep. So please feel free if you see anything that I say something that you want. Can you enable me share my slides? Is that possible? Okay, I see here.
Yes, I made you co-host. So
Right.
yes, we can
I
see your
see.
slides now.
Okay, so let's see. Let me get this out of the way. Okay, so our discussion is going to be about the independent movement. So we've structured this into two parts. The first part is to understand a bit of African nationalism, which looks at African nationalism from the militant perspective, that before 1945, African citizens across the continent under colonial rule, even those in the diaspora under colonial rule, appeared to be had accepted colonialism, and they were getting used to it. But that after 1945, the tempo changed. Before 1945, in particular, when it comes to Africa, there was some form of resistance to demand for certain things to be improved. But Africans did not demand for political power from the colonial authorities. But after 1945, the demand for political power from the colonial authorities increased. It became very militant. So the first part for today's lecture will look at this. And I decided to start from the Second World War and why the Second World War impacted nationalist thoughts in the Gold Coast, what we now call Ghana. Ghana is unique in the sense that it led the independent movement in Africa. Once Ghana's independence was gained, it opened the floodgate for others to come in. So it's important for us to understand how the World War impacted the Gold Coast. Beyond the Gold Coast, you apply the same argument across the colonized world, and you see that. So these were the readings that I circulated, share with you, and I provide a YouTube documentary for, if you are interested, just for you to see how it is. Now, the World War is global war between 1939 and 1945, which involved virtually every part of the world. Okay, yes, the principal actors, the Axis powers, Germany, Italy, Japan, and the Allies. France, Great Britain, United States, and Soviet, and later China came into the picture. This was a global war that was fought to preserve the independence and to create a free world, so-called free world in quotes. And as a result, colonized parts of the world were drawn into it. And is said to be one of the most violent in terms of the number of deaths, and it was very bloody. Now it's broke out because of the coming into power of Adolf Hitler and the Third Reich in Germany. And Hitler now consolidating his power in Germany and trying to go beyond Germany triggered the violence. And once Hitler invaded his neighbors, Germany invaded their neighbors, the others came in and responded. Now, the question to ask is how this extended to colonies like the Gold Coast, Nigeria, Kenya, okay, Jamaica, and other places. Now, these, if you see the map that of the world in the 1930s, many of these areas were still under colonial rule, effectively either under British colonial rule or French, Portuguese, or Spanish. Okay, so the British colonies played a major role in the Second World War in terms of resources, human resources, manpower, money. All of these were provided to aid the Allies' victory. You know, immediately after the war, the whole empire that had sustained British power started to crumble. Okay, and yes, largely it was thanks to the empire that Britain survived the Second World War. They came out of the war bankrupt in terms of resources and finance. Now, these were countries that also colonized sections of the world. What you see here is an image of Commonwealth troops. So these are Africans across the world. They came under the Commonwealth flag, fighting to defend freedom, fighting to protect the liberties of the free world. That was the narrative that was sold to these young Africans who went to fight and to defend the motherland, right? These are other readings that are of relevance in terms of trying to understand Africa in the Second World War. It's very important to look at these places. And the other image here showing here shows in terms of the British Empire, those African colonies that were drawn into this war. So tiny Gambia in West Africa, Sierra Leone, the Gold Coast, what is now Ghana, Nigeria. Then you come to Egypt, Sudan, all the way to southern part of Africa. All of these area, and Great Britain. Okay, the rest is France and all of that. Now, thousands of Africans were involuntarily conscripted to fight for the Allies. They didn't sign up for it. They were forced to join a war that was supposed to protect the free world. So Africans fought for the French and British, who were the major colonial powers at the time on the continent. No, Africans who were recruited came from across Africa, East Africa, British Somaliland, West Africa, the Indian Empire, Northern Rhodesia, Nyasaland, all of those places that were under British control contributed troops to fighting to defend the free world. Okay, and Africans were used in those numbers to protect what their colonial masters, in quote, communicated to them, that if the Britain and France were defeated and the Germans and their allies take power, it was going to affect those parts of the world that were colonized by these superpowers. That was the narrative that was sold to them, and so they had to fight, and they fought so hard to defend the motherland. It's estimated that more than 500,000 Africans fought for the British. in combat and not combat roles. Some serve as attachés at the bases, cooks. Some were carriers carrying logistics across. Close to 170,000 West Africans were recruited. This is quite huge. And France recruited close to 30,000 Africans from its colonies, all of them fighting in Europe in an environment that was alien to them, very cold. Okay, yes, but they were fighting to defend and protect the liberties of their colonial powers. That is close to 1,000, 2,500 Africans died in Burma. This is a huge number of Africans who fought and died defending freedom. And at the end of it, the first United Nations meeting in the 1940s, Africans also participated in the Pan-African Conference, at which they made a demand, a number of demands. And these demands were important if we frame it within the context of independence movement that this lecture is supposed to be about. All right, very important that African countries or African subjects, let's put it that way, they were subjects under British rule or French rule, were coming together and expressing some demands. This is a direct quote. This is from the Africans. We believe that the African people, by their contribution in manpower and material resources in the war against fascism, by their service in Ethiopia, Italy, and Burma, have earned the right to expect that they shall benefit as a result of the new concept of international cooperation, which has been acquired in the course of the grim ordeal of the war of liberation against fascism. End of quote. Now, I highlight sections of these quotes in bold red, where they talk about their contribution in terms of manpower. And the previous slide showed the manpower that Africans contribute. In terms of material resources, and here historians still haven't come to a consensus, but it's believed that a lot of the colonies contributed a lot of resources. Hard tropical wood was contributed, gold, okay, even money. I'll show you an example of fundraising that was done in the Gold Coast, okay, that they were fighting against fascism, okay, an evil ideology that is trying to envelop the world. Okay, so they fought so hard. But that in the course of fighting in Ethiopia, in Italy, and Burma, they earned the right to expect that they also benefit from the results or benefit from the fruits of the concept of international cooperation. Okay, so what they were demanding, in essence, was self-determination. That having fought to maintain and protect the status quo, that they needed to be given their freedom, and this is very important. But Africans who returned from Europe after the war brought with them some ideals of freedom, which they had fought for. Now, this led to the early roots of the struggle for independence in many African countries, because for the first time, Africans were fighting side by side with their European colonizers. And in the battlefield, for the first time, they also saw that the colonizer was concerned about their own welfare, okay? But of course, Africans fought bravely, and fire, some of the commanding officers who were white fled, okay? And Africans fought bravely. So this spirituality or superior concepts about the white race was broken on the battlefield. That after all, these are also mortal just like us. And so they started to demand for some rights. These are ideals that they fought so hard to preserve. Now, back on the continent, in the various colonized parts of the world, Africans began to assert themselves and to demand for some political rights. Of course, these are all images of young men who went to battle. Those who returned were the lucky ones. Several of them fought and died for a cause that they believed was just, which is trying to maintain freedom. And in the same way that when they came back, they started to demand for freedom on the continent. This is an example of how Africans contributed to the war effort. Now, this is a newspaper clipping that I've taken to illustrate how in the Gold Coast, the Asantehene Otufo Osei Ajimai Prempeh II mobilized in terms of the war effort, okay, at the Jackson Park, where they had to do a jamboree sales and collect some funds to support the war effort. So in return, what did Africans or those black subjects that were under colonial rule, what did they get out of this attempt to defend and protect the liberties that they believed that under colonial rule, and if they maintained the status quo, they would get? Of course, in return, what they got was to have monuments. In the case, this is taken from Kumasi here, where I work, in the town center. Many of the names is far away, the picture is not very clear, are the names of Africans, Ghanaians, the Gold Coasters, who went to war and did not return. This is a colonial monument that honors them, right? Then those who came back, some were lucky to be recruited into the Gold Coast police force. Okay, but the point that is important for us to take is how the Second World War, okay, that this was a war that started in Europe, Germany invading, and as a result, brought all of these other nations into this theater of conflict. They in turn recruited personnel, okay, from their colonies to support the war effort, all right? And that in the process, it affected the mentality, the conscience of black men and women who were recruited to support the war effort, and that this is the first trigger of the independent movement. So the question is, how did the Second World War trigger nationalism in the Gold Coast? How did that trigger nationalism in the Gold Coast? All right. This is a very important question for us to pause and try and understand. How did that trigger nationalism? That the idea of nations maintaining some political systems and governing themselves wasn't alien to African people. That before the continent was partitioned by these European powers, there were states in Africa, nation states. And these nation states had some well-defined boundaries. Okay, they had political systems that they used to govern themselves. They traded amongst themselves, and that there was even conflicts among these nations, what they call so-called intertribal wars. That there were fights among nation states. Okay, so the idea of nationalism wasn't alien to the African. That before the British came into the Gold Coast, they had the Fanti state. Before they went to southern part of Africa, the Zulu state was there. Eastern part of Africa, the Buganda. These were dominant nation states that governed themselves, forcibly also incorporated their weaker neighbors and expanded. They captured territory. All right. Yes, Africans had this. It wasn't something that was imported. What came and the nature of it, the change here is now the Africans who, after the partition, lived under a foreign power, were now demanding to govern themselves. Okay, so yes, the Second World War triggered a militant form of nationalism across the colonized world. Okay, yes, that subjects that were under colonial rule began to question the whole colonial system, political system. All right, they began to find fault with all the things that they had accommodated for so many years, all right, and began to demand that it was about time they governed themselves. So yes, the Second World War in the context of the Gold Coast in West Africa is major across the world. In terms of Western Europe, it impacted them psychologically, it destroyed properties, it damaged a lot of stuff. People lost their lives. Okay, in the context of Africa, Africans lost their lives, those who took part in the war in support of the colonial powers. But after the war, they had to change course and began to demand to govern themselves. Now, the impact of the war on the Gold Coast. All right. Now, these are important readings. Again, just reminding you, this is Edu Buahene, Ghana, Evolution and Change in the 19th and 20th centuries. And this is Freddie Cooper's Africa since the 1940s. Okay. In terms of the Gold Coast, international factors are important. At the end of the Second World War, that two superpowers emerged. Before 1945, America was not a superpower. United States of America wasn't a superpower. The Soviet Union did not even exist. All right. Yes, it was just Russia. But at the end of the Second World War, two new superpowers emerged. Okay. When these two superpowers emerged, the former colonial powers, Britain, France, had to recede. All right. Now, these superpowers were not in favor of maintaining colonies. They had independence, or what we call rightly a decolonization agenda. That they encourage countries that were states that were under colonial rule, yes, to assert themselves. Okay. So because of the change in ideology, because of the change in support of decolonization, the international factors created a plane that many of these colonial subjects seized. Then another important factor is the social context. The spread of Western education and the growth of urban elites, what they call the intelligentsia. Now, Edu Buahini, if you read his whole book, he looks at momentous changes across the 19th and the 20th century. Thematically, he examined a number of issues. One issue that he singled out as having contributed a lot and having made a lot of impact is Western education. Okay, that after the Second World War, there were a lot of secondary school graduates, a lot, sizable population of Gold Coast, Nigeria, Sierra Leone, if you're talking about the British sphere, there's a sizable number of people who had Western education. Many of them with a Western education moved to the urban centers in search of jobs. Accra, Lagos, Nairobi, all right. All of these people were going into these urban centers looking for jobs. In addition, those who were already in the urban centers were also looking for jobs, right? All of that contributed, okay? Yes. Then, having failed, according to Freddie Cooper, for a very long time, the colonial powers wanted to contain Africans in what he calls their tribal cages, in quote, all right? But Africans resisted that, okay? So they were forced to introduce, with the Colonial Welfare and Development Act, to introduce some welfare programs. So there was some funding to bring about development. So the colonial authorities began to provide some basic social amenities, water, pipe-borne water, infrastructure in terms of hospital clinics, all right. They began to provide all of these, some form of industrialization. But of course, all of these social economic programs, development that were happening at that time, it was to aid further British or French exploitation of the colonies. What is also important is the increased political consciousness, the principles of self-government and self-determination. Okay, this is what Nkrumah said, that we prefer self-government with danger to servitude in tranquility, end of quote. all right, that yes, the black man had come of age, and then the black man would prefer to live under a black man, if it's even dangerous living under a black man, than living quietly under a white ruler. Okay, so all of these factors contributed. You can apply them to any of these former colonies. That yes, the impact of the Second World War, the international landscape that emerged at the end of 1945, the change social context where a sizable number of Africans could not read and write. All right. Yes, and the social economic development, industrialization, and above all, increased political consciousness of the subjects. All of these contributed to making nationalism very militant. The impact of the Gold Coast, just talking about increased political consciousness, that the Gold Coast has always been an exception. The British call it a model colony, and that it was advanced, more advanced, ahead of all the other British West African colonies, right? Yes, in terms of education, in terms of an elite class, the Gold Coast had a sizable number. And what you are seeing here is a group of elites that came together to form a political movement, okay? And that movement was to demand for incorporation. They wanted to be inclusive in how decisions were made. They wanted to be part of the colonial system, but being part and leading it, okay? Very important. So I pause here and ask questions, comments before I move on.
Professor George, maybe it's good that you just point out a name, and then let's see if that works.
Yeah, it was very difficult for me. Okay. I see Letitia. There's Ruben here. Is that Ruben?
Yes, my name is Rubian.
Good. Do you have a question, something from the readings?
No, not yet. And actually, I came in later, so I was just listening to what you were saying. If that's okay, I'll have a question later.
Right. Okay.
Well, I can, if you allow me.
Yes, please.
I comment. So because it does feel like that the Second World War, with all the international relations that opened up, also added to the, at least to the consciousness of the people who went abroad or to fight or later to study. And seeing, so that's what I want to say second. So before the developments of the Second World War, the colonial powers were very much containing people into their own small, how do you call it, surroundings, bubbles, not giving them enough education, also to see what other alternatives there were. Because I live in the Netherlands, and the Netherlands also had a very big colony in Indonesia. And during the Second World War, Japan took over that colony, and they actually, there's people still angry, they humiliated the Europeans, the Netherlands. And that's what the Indonesian people saw also. And it also spurred them directly when the Second World War ended to stand up and fight against the colonizers. And they also managed to kick the Dutch people out of their country. So from your slides, what now comes to my mind is actually that the people did not have the full consciousness of the possibilities around freedom and self-governance. And actually, I'm not sure, but then the Second World War became a blessing, actually. I'm not going to say it here in Europe, but for some of the colonies, it did become a blessing that they could see also now other ways of dealing with each other. And also they did see that there was a big dent in all the white supremacy. Because before, the Europeans were treated like royals wherever they went. And then when they apparently saw that they were scared, they were sometimes humiliated, etc. It did also open the minds of the people before who did not think that was possible. So it's an interesting way of looking at the Second World War and the effect it has on the different colonies, and also how it opened the minds, the consciousness of lots of people. Because also, when I was born in this country, Suriname, and they actually all the I'll call it aluminium. So the was used for, was the resources we used to build planes. So also the colonies had a very big hand in defeating the Nazis also. So yeah, I think it was a good awakening actually then. Not going to say it like that, but you know what I mean for this in this type of discussion.
Thank you very much. Yes, there's a hand from the.
Yeah, that's me, Prof. That's me, Prof. That's Lisbeth.
Right.
Yes.
Lisbeth. Okay, Lisbeth, please.
So I also, when you asked the question, how did the Second World War, what was the question again? You asked it in the middle of your talk. How did it affect, or how did it, how did the Second World War influence the idea of nationalism? That was the, yeah, exactly.
Yes.
How did the Second World War trigger nationalism in the Gold Coast? So I was wondering, when you asked that question, I immediately thought of the fact that, you know, people on the African continent in different countries were actually quite positive about the Germans and about leaders as Hitler. There were even, you can see it in that, for instance, the name Hitler became a name for some children who were born during that period, because they saw it as, oh, that's a name of a big leader. And there are still people up even today who see Hitler as a big leader because he was able to revive the economy of Germany, and he was the one, of course, who had the message of nationalism. So I was wondering if people on this continent, even though they were fighting against the Germans alongside, you know, they were fighting for the colonial powers against the Germans, at the same time, they also admired the national aspirations of Hitler and how he was able to build up the country again, and especially for the working class people. And that admiration, I also find it here in Ghana, even up till today. And it may sound very weird for the people in Holland, and for the people in Western Europe who, you know, who experience that kind of violence and wouldn't applaud somebody like Hitler. But I was wondering if it was also, yes, if the Germany of the 40s was also influencing the national rhetoric on the African continent, that, you know, he was standing up for his own people, Hitler, and he was able to make his country to come out of the devastation of the First World War, and was able to revive the economy with of course devastating results. But I was wondering if that was also of influence, the national socialism of Hitler.
Good, good. That's a very good observation. Yes. Currently, it's difficult to direct you or fish out direct impacts of Hitler's version of National Socialism and how it influenced colonial subjects. You know how the colonies were treated, the literature that they read, books that they read at school, newspapers. These were all controlled by the colonial system. And getting the colonial subjects to understand that Hitler's version of nationalism is what will suit them. It wasn't something that the British wanted or the French promoted. The narrative that they sold to a lot of archival records, newspapers that were published during that time, was to present the Germans as super evil, and that if Hitler triumphed, it meant the end for the black man, because that National Socialism also had racist undertones, and that they would use the blacks for all of it. That was the narrative they sold to a lot of these colonial subjects. Okay, and so many who unfortunately went to fight to preserve the status quo, to preserve world freedom, fought under the pretext or the belief that, yes, with the end of the war, when they come back to the colonies, they would get what was promised them. For example, in the Gold Coast, the ex-soldiers that came were promised certain welfare benefits. When they waited 45, 46, they were not getting. 1948, February, they decided to march to the British seat government at Osu Castle, just to present a petition reminding the British government of those promises that were made. Okay, they were promised that when they return, they'll be given housing. They were promised they'll be given pension benefit compared to their white colleagues who got many of those things. But when they came back to the Gold Coast, the British government reneged on that. So they marched to present a petition, and that's when the 1948 riots broke out, when Major Henry ordered that they should be fired at, and eventually some unfortunately died as a result of that. So the British covered and blocked this, let me use the word, block any news of presenting Hitler's version of nationalism as something that, no, what was communicated was fear. All right, it's fear that if the Germans triumph, the whole world will come to an end, and that, yes, the freedom that they were enjoying would cease, and all of that was what was sold to these colonies, and to get them to commit to fight. Yes, there's a hand here. Let me, Lashanda. What is the name, please?
Lashonda, you had it right.
Yes, good, please.
So I don't know which article was for this week. I'm not gonna lie, but I had read the article with the Veranda Boys, and as I read it, it reminded me of what happened in India with the whole you had the political party that represented the Muslim section of the population and the Hindu, and at one point how they lived together. It reminded me how they basically, when the war came about and they were fighting, and the injustice that they saw amongst themselves when they fought alongside the Europeans, how they were treated versus how the Europeans were treated, and then to come back and then have all this turmoil between groups that you lived with in peace before. So basically what I got from is like the Europeans brought like separation wherever they were. They kind of brought separation through, whether it's classism or groups of religion. They brought this separation, and some people they were awakened by it, and they're like, no, this isn't right. We're not the problem, you're the problem. So I think that's what World War II brought about for some of them, right? And I would imagine that the different members, I don't know if they did this, like would they take a soldier from Ghana and bring them in India to help with the war efforts, or was it that they kept them separate? I wanted to know that. That was my question.
A good question. Thank you very much. Yes. Colonialism, the philosophy of colonialism is a superior power trying to impose their values on an inferior power, and categorizing them as so-called primitive, uncivilized people without history, and that Black history started with contact with Europeans. All of these were false. The same way, when it came to recruiting, it was divide and rule. They recruited from northern Nigeria. So interestingly, the British force that they had in the Gold Coast, they call it the Hausa Constabulary, all right, because they recruited from northern Nigeria. And in the Gold Coast, they recruited from the northern part of the Gold Coast, all right. They designated the northern part of the Gold Coast as a labor reserve. So the British did not invest anything there. Even providing secondary schools or primary schools, it was later in the colonial period that they did that. But that is how they assemble people. They brought people from different parts. And the rationale is simple, that if they recruit from the same area, you may have some troublemaker mobilizing and rising up against them. But they will bring people from different places where it will take them time to even understand the local language. It will take them time to get into the system. So by the time it's time for you to settle, they move you about. So that's how they did it. Okay, so they brought people from, so a lot of, especially in barracks area, the common language, lingua franca was Hausa. And Hausa is only spoken in the Sahel region. Okay, but they recruited a lot of soldiers from northern Nigeria, and the criteria that they use for recruiting, yes, you must be 6 foot tall and all of those. So it disqualifies some other ethnic groups within the Gold Coast. Even in Nigeria, they didn't like the Igbos. In the Gold Coast, they didn't like the Asante. All right, that these are troublemakers. And the Asante, they have this mindset of being a power before. So they rather went to places where anthropologists label them as acephalous, so-called stateless societies, and recruited from those. Those were the people they sent to the war as well. If you look at the list of names appearing on many of these memorial blocks, you find that these were people from the northern periphery. You wouldn't find people from the center. They recruited from that, and they use them for those purposes. So yes, to give a very short answer, yes, it was divide and rule. Divide the people, don't get the people from the same place come together. If you do that, you struggle to rule them. But when you divide them against themselves, then you can control and be able to implement whatever programs and policies. Yes, so that's what they did. Okay. So I wanted to go back to an observation that DR made. So he says that in a way, the Second World War was a blessing. Yes, and I found that this is so profound. That yes, in a way, it was a blessing in disguise. At the same time, I wanted to point out something, that even if we didn't have the Second World War, but many historians had come to the consensus that from the mid-1930s onward, the colonial project was not going to be sustainable. The colonial project would have had to adapt a very radical framework to be able to survive. But at the same time, the British, the French, the Spanish, they were not prepared. They were not in a hurry to leave. They were here to stay. But what they wanted to do, which is the next presentation I'm going to give, was to claim that they were preparing these colonies. They were providing the building blocks so that these colonies can govern themselves. They wanted to improve the political system. They wanted to improve the economic system and the social system. But they wanted to do that at their own pace, okay? But what the Second World War did was to stop that and to fast track the whole process, okay, of decolonization. But in a way, they were going to do that. So the blessing of the Second World War from the observation that you made comes in the sense that it quickened the process. It laid bare many of these false narratives that for centuries were built, a narrative of superiority, okay? Yes, a narrative of a white race that was destined to rule other races, that all of that got broken down on the battlefront. And colonial subjects began to ask very critical questions of the whole colonial system. Is it legitimate? Before colonialism, how were we governing ourselves? Do we have political systems? Yes. Then before colonialism, a number of centralized states across Africa governed themselves peacefully. Of course, there was some amount of violence, and we see the same even in the evolution of states in Western Europe. The powerful ones incorporated the weaker ones and expanded. All right. Yes, this process was happening in Africa. Okay. You come to Ghana, for example, at the height of the Asante Empire or state, it enveloped completely what is now modern Ghana. All right. It had a political system that was highly sophisticated. Yes, that the Asante Hene could be very powerful. At the same time, he could be moved from office if he broke some grounds that he wasn't meant to. All right. So these were the questions that Africans were beginning to ask themselves. Okay, can we govern ourselves? Yes. And on top of it, exposure to Western education contributed a lot. They are now questioning the same things that these guys for over years have taught them and forced them to believe that this is what is supposed to be, that you don't have a history. All right. That the history you are going to read at schools is a history of the white man in Africa. Okay. But they are now getting to question this narrative of white superiority. Now there's battle, and the narrative was sold to them that this is a fight to maintain world peace, to preserve the status quo. If you allow for German to triumph, that's going to be the end. Okay. So they blocked all the counter narratives but the critical minds began to ask and question the whole political system, and eventually the demands for political independence were too loud that they just had to let go. Okay, they had to let go. Yes. Do we have any other comment, question? Other than that,
I think we are ready for the 10-minute break, if I'm
yes.
correct.
Yes, you are very correct. I see that.
Yeah.
So
So then,
let's take a 10-minute break and we'll come back.
yes.
Yeah.
Thank you
Thank
very much. Let me stop sharing my slides.
Yes, Professor. I
Yes,
think we can continue.
good.
Yes.
Okay, so let me welcome all of you back. So we'll look at it's a continuation of what we're discussing. So here we want to look at the struggles, okay, how the nationalists struggled, first of all, evolved the inner workings of the various nationalist movements and what the goal was by this nationalist movement in the Gold Coast. Again, not to sound very repetitive, but the Gold Coast is a good model to look at because of how the nationalist movements here structured themselves and eventually led the country to gain political independence from the British. These are some of the readings that are relevant for this discussion. The Gold Coast, what is now Ghana, was administered on behalf of the British by a governor. Now, before the British started appointing governors to represent the interests of the crown, the Gold Coast had several European powers along the coast. Prussians, the Portuguese, the Dutch, the Danes, and the British, eventually the Swedes, they all came to the Gold Coast in search of goods and commodities. And of course, the name of the country as Gold Coast, the claim is that gold was easily found along the coast. They named the commodity that they found in abundance along the west coast. So we had the grain coast, the pepper coast, and the gold coast. So the Gold Coast was administered by a trading group of merchants who wanted to protect their interests. So it's the merchants that initially appointed governors so that their interests would be protected. They created forts and castles along the coast. And these forts and castles also had warehouses where goods that they brought from Europe could be stored, traded with the local commodities that were in abundance. But after 1874, all of these things changed, where the British were now keen, interested. Not only that, the other European powers had left. They sold their possessions to the British. The Danes and the Dutch sold their possessions in the Gold Coast to the British. So Christiansborg Castle, which was built by the Danes, became a British owned as a result of this. So the British Crown colony of the Gold Coast was now administered on behalf of the British colony by a governor appointed by the Crown from England. So the Executive Council consisted of the Colonial Secretary, based in London, the Chief Commissioner of Asante, the Chief Commissioner of the Northern Territories, the Attorney General, Financial Secretary, the Director of Medical Services, Secretary of Native Affairs. That was the Executive Council. And for administrative purposes, the Gold Coast was divided into 3 areas. So you had the colony. So the colony proper covered what we now have the modern day part of the eastern, western, and greater Accra regions of Ghana. That is where the colony proper is. Then after the colony, you have Asante, and beyond Asante is the Northern Territories. Right. And these were subdivided into provinces. So you had the eastern, central, and western. And you had the southern section of the Togoland under British mandate. Togoland was formerly a German colony, but when Germany lost the First World War, German possessions in Africa were taken over and administered, mandated by the international trustees, by the British and the French. So Togoland was divided. So you have the British sphere, British Togoland, and you have the French Togoland. And if you go to Tanganyika, what is now Tanzania, yes, then Southwest Africa, what is now Namibia, those were all German possessions that were taken over. So you had the Ashanti and the Northern Territories that included the Togoland, as I mentioned, and these were subdivided into districts. And each was headed by a district commissioner who worked under the chief commissioner. So in terms of hierarchy, the areas, you had the governor general who represented the crown as the head of the particular colony. Then below the governor are these chief commissioners, and below the chief commissioners, you have the district commissioners. All of these administrative offices work together to implement British colonialism, at the same time, collectively to explore whatever opportunities they found in the areas that was under their control. In terms of British colonial governors that have administered the Gold Coast, it's always important to look from the 1920s. And the image that I'm showing you here, the officer dressed in military fatigue is Governor Gordon Gorgesbet, right? Gorgesbet was seen as very progressive. He was seen as different from the other colonial administrators that administered the Gold Coast, all right? Yes. Then Alan Burns is down there, another very progressive but controversial, who worked in the interest of the crown. So they worked with the Legislative Council, all right, including the chief commissioners of Asante and the Northern Territories, and they had 14 unofficial members, and these were chiefs who and some other interested sections of the Gold Coast colony. The system of government was a mixture of direct and indirect rule, right? But more often is said to be indirect, based on the recommendations of Lord Lugard. Lord Lugard had experimented with an indirect form of political administration in India and in East Africa. So when he wrote his dual mandate, the book that he published titled The Dual Mandate, he recommended strongly that wherever the British went and there were local structures in place, that the British should not try to create new structures or parallel structures, but that they could rule indirectly through those structures. Okay, so for example, in Sokoto, in the Sokoto Caliphate, northern Nigeria, in East Africa, central part of East Africa, Uganda, the Baganda already had a very well laid out administrative structure that enabled them to govern. He says, you just maintain that and use that to rule over the people. In the case of the Gold Coast, those centralized states like the Akan states, Denchira, Achim, Asante, Fante, that already these places had some form of political systems that could enable the British to govern very well. So they used those, but it was a mixture. In areas that they didn't have, like in the Northern Territories, where they had very few states, many of those ethnic groups, the anthropologists later on categorized them as stateless, as cephalos, that these were ethnic groups that did not have central authority ruling over them, but that they were governed by clan norms. Okay, yes, and that the F priests, these are elders within the communities who were in charge of managing resources in terms of land, demarcation of land, in terms of custom. They were the guardians of all of these. Okay, that yes, those people were there, but the British needed to have structures in place. So they created chieftaincy systems in those areas. But above all, everyday administration was mainly in the hands of the chiefs. Now, these chiefs in centralized states were those who were running the show, in charge of passing down orders from the chief commissioners or district commissioners in their respective areas. And they were assisted by a council of elders. So the chief and the councillors constituted a tribunal, all right, in terms of cases that were bordering on criminal or civil. They would come in, their judgment, of course, was subject to the district commissioners sitting as magistrate. Then, as still on the government system of government, at the top they had the municipal administration, and the municipal administration had town councils. Okay, we had a very few of them in places like Cape Coast, Accra, and Sekondi. Okay, each council was invested with powers and duties, and under certain ordinances, they were able to carry out lightening and conservancy works within those areas, especially when it comes to the area of public health. You know, West Africa was described as the white man's grave because of the presence of malaria, mosquitoes. Mosquitoes swampy West Africa was very deadly. It's because of that, the British and the French invested a lot in public health. They created communities that were very, very exclusive. Okay, in a place like Rich in Accra, it was the European quarters. Blacks were not allowed to go there. Blacks only went there if they were domestic servants or working. All right. But that was how they invested in public health, and they used the municipal administrative structures to maintain sanity, to provide for sanitation facilities, and to use the municipal bylaws to regulate the behavior of subjects. There were places subjects could not go. These were European quarters, these were African quarters, and all of that. These were how the system was organized. And in terms of Kumasi, they had a municipal board, which was the Kumasi Public Health Board, formed in 1925, all right, which was running based on the revenues that it generated from licenses and fees, all right. Yes, and they were very passionate about sanitation and town planning, trying to manage, okay, all because of the nature of the environment, very swampy nature of the Asante environment. That yes, it became very very not friendly for Westerners. So all of these were investments that they made through taxing the local people. Of course, these were not funds that were brought from elsewhere. It was through taxes that they mobilized to be able to provide some good public health, just to make themselves comfortable, to enable them further exploit the resources that they found in these areas. Of course, in terms of native administration, there is the issue of recognition by central governments, all right, represented by the governor, that yes, native administration, chiefly in the hands of local authorities, many of them own their position either through hereditary, especially within the centralized states, family groups. Some were also appointed by the colonial authorities, but above all, recognition by the central government, represented by the governor, was very, very important. The chiefs who didn't have resources or were in less endowed areas, where they didn't have economic resources, let me put it that way, economic resources, they didn't have a regular income to maintain those kind of prestigious positions. Government had to pay them some allowance, but this became an obstacle to native administration, especially in the colony and in the northern territories. Again, to recap what we discussed in the earlier part, the impact of the Second World War, how it influenced the independence movement. Yes, economic development as a major thing that we looked at, talk of a political and social progress. Then the psychological effects of the war itself on all the participants, whether you were the victors or those that were the vanquished, it affected them psychologically, okay? Then the post-war problems after the return from battle, what the fighting force that came back experienced. All of these impacted them. Is just a recap. Then they talk of a political advance. Now, the image that I'm showing you is important. Focus and you see that there were more blacks in this formal picture taking than the white rulers. Okay, yes. That was the new Gold Coast Legislative Council. Okay, immediately after the Second World War, that many more black voices, black representation was promoted. It was increased. Of course, it was just representation without effective power. Power was still in the hands of the governor and the chief commissioners. All right. Yes, they populated the executive council with blacks, but executive power was still in the hands of the ruling minority, and these were the British officers that represented the interests of the crown. But in the context of political movement, this was an advancement in the political field. All right, this was an advancement in the sense that for the first time, many more Africans were being represented in the new Gold Coast Legislative Council. This is a direct quote. I'm talking about political advance, and I'll read. This is taken from the annual report. It says, in March 1946, the governor announced to the Legislative Council that His Majesty the King had been pleased to grant a new constitution to the Gold Coast. The existing Legislative Council, which had made laws for the colony only, contained majority of civil servants and members nominated by the governor. The new council was to legislate for Asante as well as the colony and was to have an elected majority. The Gold Coast was thus to be the first colony in tropical Africa to be granted an elective majority in its legislature. The members of the new council would number 31. The governor would be the president, and there will be 6 official members and 6 unofficial members nominated by the governor. The remaining 18 members were to be elected, 9 by the colony, 4 by Asante, 5 by the 4 municipalities. The governor looked forward to the day when the Northern Territories too would elect representatives to sit on the council. End of quote. Now, this is very important, that for the first time, the Gold Coast again becomes the leader in tropical Africa to be granted an elected majority in its legislature. Okay, yes. So this, in the context of colonial development, was an advancement. It was an improvement from what was prevailing. That before this period, there were few Africans who represented the whole colony, but the number had been increased. Okay, this was something that was coming immediately after the Second World War in March 1946. This is very important. So the Burns administration, Governor Burns, was appointed governor of the Gold Coast in 1941. And in 1942, he persuaded the colonial office to admit Africans onto the Executive Council of the colony. In 1946, he inspired a new constitution, under which the Legislative Council consisted of 6 ex-officio members, 6 nominated members, and 18 elected. As a result, there was an African majority on the council. This is very important. For the first time, in terms of representation, that you now have an African majority. But we need to pause and ask the question, majority with powers, or majority just in terms of numbers, numerals? That yes, in terms of numbers, you could count many more black faces, more than white faces, but then in terms of power still resided with the few whites that were there. So this is important, and we needed to qualify that. The national struggle for political rights. And here asks, outline the factors that precipitated the formation of the United Gold Coast Convention. So the article that I recommended for you to read, the one that I authored, it's important for you to reflect on that, yes, what factors precipitated or triggered the Gold Coast nationalists to form the United Gold Coast Convention? Okay, what factors? Several factors. And that why did it happen the time it happened and not earlier? All right, this is important for us. Why did the Gold Coast nationalists mobilize themselves after 1945? They could have done the mobilization before 1945. Why did it happen after 1945? This is very important. Okay, now yes, there were certain triggers. The 1945, post-1945 environment was different and allowed for the mobilization of intellectual power, allowed for the contestation of colonial power in the colonies, and this is very important. Social fields, we have to look at the persistent demands for higher education. That all through, especially from the 1920s all the way to the war period and after the war period, there were consistent demands by Africans for higher education. Africans wanted to have higher educational institutions built on the continent, built in the various colonial territories. All right. So the demands became so loud that the British had to give in, and they formed a commission of inquiry to study the problem and to recommend to the colonial secretary in London whether it was feasible to have a university college for the British colonies. So the Elliott Commission report came out in 1946. This is immediately after the Second World War. And the recommendations contained in this report angered the elites and the chiefs. What were the recommendations? It recommended that for British West Africa, that the demand to have a university college was feasible, but that for the size of population that we are talking about in British West Africa, that the recommendation was to have one university college based at Ibadan in Nigeria, and that the 4 other territories could send their wards there for university education. So those from the Gold Coast would send their wards to Ibadan. Those from Sierra Leone would send their wards there, the Gambia, right? So this recommendation angered the elite across West Africa. They demanded and they contested strongly the recommendation, and they made a counter proposal that the infrastructure was already there, the foundation was in existence, and that the foundation could be built upon. And again, more importantly, the people were prepared to mobilize their own financial resources. If the colonial government didn't have the resources, they were prepared to mobilize financial resources to support setting up university colleges across the various territories. So eventually, the British government gave in to this demand, and that's what resulted in the establishment of the University College of the Gold Coast in Accra at Achimota, the University College in Ibadan, what became University of Ibadan, and in Sierra Leone, they upgraded for a Bay College. All right. Then the unemployment situation worsened after the Second World War. Okay, as we discussed in the earlier session, that many more Africans were now having access to education that was provided by the missionaries. So with education, many of them moved to the urban centers to look for non-existent jobs. So as a result, there was a huge number of unemployed youth in these areas. Okay, then these were compounded by the ex-servicemen who came back from the war. Okay, so steadily there's a number of elementary school leavers. All of them are demanding for jobs. All right, so this unemployment situation was very critical. Then the economic situation itself further deteriorated. In the context of the Gold Coast, exports from cocoa were kept in Britain. Cocoa was cultivated through the agency of peasant farmers in the Gold Coast. It wasn't promoted by the colonial government. It was the Gold Coast peasant farmers that saw the profit that they could gain from cocoa, and cocoa cultivation spread from the eastern part all the way to Asante. And the peasants embraced it, and the colonial government came in to set up a marketing board to sell it. So the farmers are cheated in the Gold Coast. They have a fixed price that the colonial government pays to the farmer and takes the cocoa to international market and sell it for a higher price. All right. So the cocoa farmers questioned the profits that Britain kept in Britain. Then the government's decision to cut down cocoa trees that were affected by the swollen shoot disease further angered the cocoa farmers. They thought that it was a conspiracy by the colonial state, okay, to undercut their profits margins by destroying their farms. But for the British and scientifically, the swollen shoot disease was spreading and affecting cocoa pods. So it's a mealbag kind of virus that affects, and it was spread from farm to farm through wind. So the only way, and this was a new viral disease that science did not have a solution to. But what they realized they could do to contain the spread of the swollen shoot disease was to cut down affected cocoa trees. And this was resisted by the cocoa farmers. So the cocoa farmers also had a grudge against the colonial state. All right. The youth who were unemployed had a grudge against the colonial state. The elites, everybody had something, some form of disgruntlement against the colonial state. All right. And trading in the field of trading, the introduction of quota systems during the war for the importation of goods eliminated many of the local people, and this area now became dominated by foreign firms led by the British. They classified themselves and put themselves into an association known as the Association of West African Merchants. But these were West African merchants that were white and that dominated. Of course, there were black collaborators that were there, but in terms of hierarchy, at the top, those that were in charge dominated the wholesale field were all expatriates who were there. Blacks were further down and they were engaged in retailing. Okay, yeah, so all the agitations for participation in the political affairs of the colony also raised the question of effective representation. No contribution, no chop, as we say in West Africa. That as long as we are contributing to the colonial system, then we have a legitimate question to ask of how we are being represented. And that legitimately, the majority of the people living in the colony should be represented by their own. Okay, so the question of representation was also invoked in all of these political rights that colonial subjects were demanding from the colonial authorities. Then the issue of the color bar, and this is a direct quote from one of the nationalists, William Oforata. He says, and I quote him, so the color picture of Ghana was irritating, end of quote. He continues, every senior or high office in the colonial and the civil service was occupied by an expatriate, a white man. In the commercial field, all the bosses. Somebody's please, can you turn your this thing down off? Sorry, right. Let me continue. Says in the commercial field, all the bosses were white. Even in the churches, the situation was no different. All the top clergy were white. To add insult to injury, those few Africans who were fortunate enough to attain high office were described as occupying European posts. And certain areas of our country were described as European quarters or areas, end of quote. Okay, so all of these issues complicated the story. It complicated the experience of blacks across the colonial world. And they began to question the colonial system. Then they began to mobilize. So in the context of the Gold Coast, two political traditions emerged. The first one came as a result of the activities of a wealthy merchant, George Alfred Grant, known as Pa Grant. He, as a merchant, had some scores to settle with the colonial system. He was cheated all the time, and he wanted to have the way that he will be able to trade independently. So he used his resources to invite 40 people they describe as a representative to a conference at Salt Pond. The delegates that he invited were to consider proposals for the formation of a political party. Now, in the 1940s, news dissemination went very, very slow. So not many people heard of this important gathering of business and political elites. Business and political elites coming together to discuss how to form a movement and what was the agenda for this political movement that they wanted to form. And so this is an editorial, and you'll find the same thing in the article that I assigned to you for reading. It's a very important quote for me, and I'll take it. It says here, the UGCC, a name to conjure with. It has a magical ring. It has no doubt startled some persons in certain quarters and set them thinking, what is it all about? The Gold Coast too, are they not a pack of self-complacent, easygoing, pleasure-loving creatures? Yes, assess the Gold Coast African and give him any unfavorable or low value you like. Yet at heart, he is entirely different. He possesses latent qualities that elude the foreign appraiser or assessor. Even the most aimless and self-loving indigene of this country possesses a spark that can be easily fanned into flame. End of quote. This is very profound and powerful for me. It describes the people of the Gold Coast, very peace-loving, gentle, but yes, each and every one possesses something that immediately there's a match it can light, and that is what eventually the British learned, and they learned that bitter lesson. They thought that the Gold Coast was a model colony. The Gold Coast had accepted British rule, but the people of the country were waiting at the right time. Of course, two polka traditions now emerge. The first is the tradition that came in August of 1947, the United Gold Coast Convention, which was launched at Solpong by the Gold Coast intelligentsia. Now, the membership of the convention is interesting. It was made up of lawyers, it was made up of teachers, it was made up of businessmen, okay, and women, all right, and they were supported by the chiefs, okay. Then they invited, now these members of the convention were very busy people who didn't have time to dedicate full time of their energies to party mobilization. So they needed a full-time organizer or general secretary. So they discussed it amongst themselves. And one of them, Ajay, recommended that, oh, there's this young Ghanaian, a student he met in America, and that he would be a very good person to invite. So the leaders agreed, and they extended an invitation to Kwame Nkrumah, who had moved from the United States of America to England and was pursuing further education, which he eventually gave up. Then he was deeply involved in the Pan-Africanist movement in the UK, mobilizing, educating, creating awareness of the colonial situation. So Nkrumah was invited and offered the job of a full-time general secretary, which he accepted and came and joined the Gold Coast Convention. Immediately Nkrumah joined, he started to expand the structures of the political movement beyond the few urban centers that had the party facilities, party offices. He went beyond the Akan areas, and came to Kumasi and went all the way to the Northern Territories, establishing party offices, engaging in political education, making the case for why the citizens or subjects should support the nationalist movements. Okay, yes. Then comes the 1948 riots, which I mentioned earlier. This was a reaction against the shooting and killing of ex-servicemen at the Christianborg Castle when they went to present a petition. So in the event, the political elites capitalized on the disturbances that the boycott that Niboni announced, Ghana chief in Accra, encouraging the colonial subjects to boycott European goods. So eventually, the colonial authorities arrested the Gold Coast Convention leaders. 6 of them were arrested and sent into jail, sent to different parts of the country and put in prison. So they called them the Big Six. So the Big Six went to jail because they tried to capitalize on this colonial disturbance in the colony, but the British colonial authorities blamed the Big Six, or we call them the convention executive, the working convention. Okay, that they were the instigators of this disturbance. And for the first time, the disturbance shook the colonial system itself. The British felt it, and they wanted to contain it. They didn't want it to spread to the other areas of the district. So they were sent to prison, and eventually the colonial government commissioned a group of experts to study and to advise the government what was the causes of the disturbance. So when the committee was formed, to investigate public hearings. All the big six members were invited except Kwame Nkrumah. Nkrumah was not invited to be a member of the Kusi committee. So eventually the Kusi committee report came out. But of course, by 1948, there were fractures in the leadership front of the convention. You could see that ideologically, there were two ideologies that were fighting to be contained in the same space. Nkrumah was very progressive, right, versus the conservative leadership that offered him the job. Okay, so these two political ideas were fighting for supremacy, were fighting to have a voice. But of course, the youth that supported the convention also realized that the political leadership were not adequately prepared to fight for political independence for the Gold Coast. Like I said, these were self-made men, lawyers, businessmen who were very busy, right? So the youth encouraged Nkrumah to break away from the convention. And Nkrumah eventually broke away in June of 1949 and launched his own political movement. But because Nkrumah was a political strategist, a good mobilizer, right, he was able to capitalize. Even the name that he chose for his movement, he still added convention. His was the Convention People's Party. And the one that he came out of was the United Gold Coast Convention. All right. So he moved with the youth, founded the CPP, charted a new course. There were two competing political ideologies now. The UGCC wanted political independence, but their slogan was political independence in the shortest possible time. The CPP, Convention People's Party, wanted political independence now. So you see the two differences in terms of how the nationalists frame the independence question. Whereas the conservative UGCC wanted political independence, but they felt that it wasn't something that was urgent, that it needed time. All right, so they wanted political independence in the shortest possible time. The other group felt that the time was right, and that as a people coming together, they will to rule themselves. So Nkrumah wanted political independence now. This is very important, and these two political traditions have over time evolved, okay, and eventually the Convention People's Party that Kwame Nkrumah led succeeded. The first time that the British organized elections, June 1951, the Convention People's Party, Nkrumah was then serving jail term because he had published a very libelous letter against the colonial state. So he was doing some time in jail. But somehow the British allowed him to be registered. So he was registered and he won his seat. So from jail, he became the leader of government business. Again, the British struggled. They didn't know what title to use for Nkrumah. Effectively, in terms of British parliamentary democracy, the political party with the majority of seats in parliament elects the prime minister, but they didn't want to call Kwame Nkrumah prime minister. So they gave him a very nebulous title as leader of government business. And then subsequently, there was another election in 1954. And again, the Convention's People's Party triumphed. So after 54, the assumption was that independence was within reach. Ghana was almost ready to be granted political independence. But immediately after that election, the issue of Asante nationalists came into the frame. That in the run-up to the 1954 election, the Convention People's Party led by Kwame Nkrumah, had promised the citizens of this country certain things. For example, cocoa farmers were promised that the price of the tonnage of cocoa would increase. Now, when Nkrumah eventually won political power, he reneged on his promise. So this angered the Asante cocoa farmers, who were the majority of cocoa farmers in the country then. And they felt that their interest was at stake. Secondly, the propaganda that was used was an anti-chieftaincy. So the traditional rulers who the British called the natural rulers, felt threatened by this radical movement led by young veranda boys who were nobodies but were made by the colonial system. So they also felt threatened. So as a result, the Asante chiefs and farmers presented a counter proposal that yes, Ghana would gain independence, but only under a federal constitution. And that federalism as a political system would suit their interests. They wanted that. Nkrumah countered that argument by saying that the country was too small to be given a federal constitution, and that a unitary system of political governance would be ideal, all right, and that colonialism had produced differences, okay, and that if you allow for a federal kind of political structure to be implemented, those differences would be magnified, and as a result, you will have communities fighting against each other. Okay, eventually the British gave in to the federalist argument and allowed for another commission of inquiry to do its work, and eventually they decided that they must have another election before political independence. So 1956, another election was organized, and again, with all the other political parties joining forces, but the CPP and the Kwame Nkrumah triumphed, and Ghana gained independence on 6th of March 1957. In that context, it became the first among the black colonies. It became the first among oppressed people in other places, and it became the model for others. Of course, Nkrumah was also very conscious of his position as the first leader of an independent country, and he mortgaged Ghana's independence to the total liberation of the African continent, where he said that Ghana independence was meaningless unless it was linked with the total liberation of the continent. And eventually, that was what he did, and proceeded to provide logistical support for independent movements across the continent. Okay, he formed alliances with Africans in the diaspora. Okay, George Padmore came to advise him. Du Bois relocated to Ghana. Yes, he wanted to have that, and of course, if you know the Nkrumah story very well, you know that he was philosophically very, very influenced by Marcus Garvey's works. All right, so he wanted to have a black star on the continent, promoting black interests, maintaining and developing. Okay, that is, the black man was capable of managing his own affairs. So yes, so that is the bit on the second part on the independence. So I will pause here. Questions, comments, observations, things that you want to share, please feel free and jump in. I don't like putting people on the spot. Yeah, so, but sometimes as an instructor, you're forced to put people on the spot. So yes, I invite your participation now. Anything that you want me to clarify, I'll be happy to do that.
Yeah, Maureen here. I would
Yes,
like to
please.
have some names of who were exactly the Big Six. And are there names of women who were participated in the conventions? Do you have some names?
Yes, good question. Thank you. Yes, so the Big Six, we had Kwame Nkrumah as one. You had J.B. Dankwa. You had William Ofori Atta. You have Edward Akufo-Addo. You have Obichabi Lamte and Akua J. So these were the Big Six. All right. In a way, historians have criticized is that who made them the Big Six? These were just 6 men who were arrested. All right. Yes. So they, when Ghanaians and the literature you read, they talk of the Big Six. These are the Big Six. Kwame Nkrumah, who was the general secretary, J.B. Dankwa, a top lawyer, William Oforata, Akua J, Obichabi Lamte, Yes, empowerment. All of them, they put them there. There was no woman among this group. All right. But in terms of support for the nationalist movement, you had women like Mrs. Eisen. Okay, her name comes up. All right. Then Ama Nkrumah, who were women, who were traders, very resourceful women who mobilized their resources to support the system. Now, this is the challenge with the historiography. But because this period was studied by men and men wrote the history, they didn't pay much attention to the role, a very important role that women played. But imagine research these days have shown the role that women played. And in my own article, I showed that when the motion was put to debate at Solpong, the women of the Gold Coast supported that movement. All right, they contributed. Market women contributed money to support Nkrumah. And in Nkrumah's autobiography, he mentions that how he didn't have any resources. It was the mobilization of these market women that propelled the CPP. All right. So yes, that's a very important question you asked. But in terms of the big six, they were all men. Okay, we need to revisit that and also add some women to the independence struggle and the role that they played. It was very important. So yes, that's my response to the question.
When you brought that up about the market women, it reminded me of the rebellion they had in Nigeria when they were trying to tax the women on their products and how that propelled the movement in Nigeria. So would you say like market women in general across Africa, they were like the financiers and the people who like mobilized for these movements?
Good question. Thank you. Yes, the Aba, they call the Aba Women's movement in Nigeria. Yes, they also contested. We have very few examples across Africa of women mobilizing, using their resources to support the nationalist movement. So you have the Gold Coast case, the example that I gave, Nkrumah's own writing showing that it was market women. They will have the example in Nigeria. But beyond these two cases, in other places, yes, in Southern Rhodesia, what became the Zambia, in the Copper Belt, we saw women also supporting their husbands to boycott work and all of those things. But there are very few. And again, there are few because, like I said, it's men who wrote that history. Okay, and many of them were not too keen to probe further and to see what role women played. The few women examples that we've seen magnified were presented as exceptional cases. Of course, here in the Gold Coast in Ghana, how a woman mobilized her people to stand up against the British. We talk of the Yasantua War. Okay, a Queen Mother from Ejisu was able. Now this becomes a central figure in this anti-colonial struggle, but a woman. Okay, there are other examples. Okay, but the only examples that we have in the documentary literature is this example I've given for the Gold Coast, the mobilization, and the one you mentioned in Nigeria, the Aba women's movement coming and putting pressure on all of that. So that is my response to that. Okay.
I think we are ready for another 10-minute break, Professor Milia.
Yes, but I wanted to, I told Dr. Nimo that today I will end at 6 p.m. Ghana time.
Okay.
Okay, yes, so it's 6:01 now. So I'm not sure he communicated that to you, but that was the agreement I had with him. So we will end it for today.
Yeah.
Then I'll get back to him. If he's going to reschedule me for another one, I will let you know.
Will it be
But,
possible for you to share the PowerPoint
slides?
slides?
Yes, I can. If you send me, I don't know how to, I can share my email with you in the chat.
Yeah, please do. Then we can, then I will send you the email. You can send the slide deck.
Yes.
As a response.
Yes, I would.
I haven't, before we end, this was a question I was in my mind about the different peoples fighting or looking for independence in their own way. So you had the elite group, and well, I will call them the elite group because they were the lawyers and the teachers and
Yes.
businessmen. So they did have some funds also
Yes.
to, but the reason they were in this group, is it always because they were allowed to be in the group by the colonial power? So they got the educations and they have allowed to do some, to grow in their business fortunes. Because often you see when they say first you get elected before you get selected. So the colonial power had an idea like this group could be very useful for us to keep the way of affairs, the whole economic system alive, grow them to be like a neo-colonial power, maybe. And the philosophy and ideology of Kwame Nkrumah crossed this a little bit, and he was able to gather the support of the people who were not part of this elite structure in Ghana. That's always, you see in every, because often it looks like the colonial power fights against the anti-colonial forces, but often within these anti-colonial forces, there are like different sections also, and some of those, they want to keep the existing structure, but only what they want to change is black faces in high places. So the Africans take over the positions of the Europeans, but the same system keeps in place. And I was wondering if there was such a type of ideology with the elite group also present at that time.
Yes, very good question. Thank you for asking it. That the elite group that the colonial system created were a group of Africans who the colonialists thought would be amenable to the system, that they are a product of the colonial system. For example, J.B. Dankwa went to England for his law education. He had a PhD from University of London. He came back to the colony. He was practicing his law. He was allowed to do things. All right. Yes. These were the group of guys that the colonial system were preparing, that eventually, when they leave, these are the guys that they will hand over political power to. So Nkrumah's last book before his administration was overthrown, he started neocolonialism. Nkrumah says that the colonial system created many of these guys across Africa. That now Africa is being led by black people, but that their thinking and philosophy is in line with what the British, who had departed a decade ago, wanted, and they've maintained that. So these guys were not out to destroy the colonial system. So in the context that I gave, the challenge they had with Nkrumah was that Nkrumah was too radical. But Nkrumah was different because among the Gold Coast elite, all of them had their education in Britain. Nkrumah went to North America, United States, Lincoln, UPenn, and his experience in America was different. In America, he saw blacks who were at the lowest rank, okay? He saw racism, all right? So he had a different experience, okay? So he was a different elite within that elite group. So from the word go, you realize that there were tensions between these two groups. But the other groups, yes, they were those that they were creating. The same with the French system, where you had to assimilate totally to become a good Frenchman. You should understand French ethics, okay? So somebody like Ofoyi Boigny of Côte d'Ivoire, Leopold Senghor of Senegal, yes, these were fully assimilated black elites, all right, who the French were very comfortable with sharing power with. So they created all of these, okay? So there were different groups of elites. But even within the French system, you see that those who eventually led or were leaders in the independent movement, they were slightly different, like Guinea and Secretary. Secretariat got independence for Guinea immediately after Ghana in 1958. But he was different. And the French didn't like him. So the French wanted to teach Guinea a lesson. They packed almost everything, including pens, so that the others will be discouraged from demanding for political independence. But yes, it's a very important question for us to look at the elite groups and what was the motive. So you see, in the context of the Gold Coast, the UGCC wanted political independence. They said that in the shortest possible time. That is when the British rule and they are fed up and they are leaving. They will now entrust political power into the hands of this elite group. Now, Nkrumah comes out and says that no, the British will never give you power. You have to fight for power, and that the fight will be very bloody, but you needed to fight for it. So he changed the narrative by saying that independence now. And this is his strategy. Now he's able to mobilize the youth. And many of these village folks and town folks who he convinced that with political independence, their social circumstances, lifestyle would improve. All of them came and followed. But of course, he was a different elite from this other group of elites. Yeah, so that's what I'll say when it comes to that. So the other issue some scholars have raised that some of the elite groups were collaborators with the colonial system. They collaborated with the intention that if you collaborate and there's adequate planning, there's adequate preparation, we will eventually succeed. And that is the examples that I gave of Oyiboanye of La Côte d'Ivoire, Leopold Senghor of Senegal. They were very good collaborators, and they were actually French black men in the real sense of the word, and they assimilated totally in that case. Yeah.
Thank you very much for this one. Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, so I'll put my email there. If you send me a hi, I'll share these slides with you, and you can share with your colleagues, and you let me know the reading that you said they do one. I will also try and see if I can scan that and share with you so that you have the reading. Okay.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Have a
bye
very
bye.
nice
So
evening.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Yes. Bye.
You.